documents, lay behind the Torah. This approach accounted for the Torah's diversity but could not account for its structural consistency, particularly regarding chronology. 96. The supplementary hypothesis was better able to explain this unity. It maintained that the Torah was made up of a central core document, the Elohist, supplemented by fragments taken from many sources. 96. The supplementary approach was dominant by the early 1860s, but it was challenged by an important book published by Hermann Hupfeld in 1853, who argued that the Pentateuch was made up of 4 documentary sources: the priestly, Yahwist, and Elohist intertwined in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and the standalone source of Deuteronomy. 97. At around the same period, Karl Heinrich Graf argued that the Yahwist and Elohist were the earliest sources and the priestly source the latest, while Wilhelm Vattke linked it to an evolutionary framework, the Yahwist and Elohist to a time of primitive nature and fertility cults, the Deuteronomist to the ethical religion of the Hebrew prophets, and the priestly source to a form of religion dominated by ritual, sacrifice and law. 98. Wellhausen and the new documentary hypothesis. Julius Wellhausen in 1878. Julius Wellhausen published Geschichte Israels, BD 1, History of Israel, Vol 1. The second edition he printed as Prolegomena a Geschichte Israels, Prolegomena to the History of Israel, in 1883, and the work is better known under that name. 99. The second volume, a synthetic history titled Israelitische und Jüdische Geschichte, Israelite and Jewish History, did not appear until 1894 and remains untranslated. Crucially, this historical portrait was based upon 2 earlier works of his: technical analysis, Die Compositions Hexatage, the composition of the Hexatage, of 1876/77, and sections on the historical books, Judges Kings, in his 1878 edition of Friedrich Bleek's Einleitung in das Old Testament, Introduction to the Old Testament. Diagram of the 20th century documentary hypothesis. J. Yahwist, 10th 9th century BCE, 100, 101. E. Elohist, 9th century BCE, 100. DTR1, early, 7th century BCE, Deuteronomist historian. DTR2, later, 6th century BCE, Deuteronomist historian. P***, priestly, 6th 5th century BCE, 67, 101. D. Deuteronomist. R. Redactor. D.H. Deuteronomistic History, Books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Wellhausen's documentary hypothesis owed little to Wellhausen himself. It was mainly the work of Hupfeld, Edouard Eugene Reus, Graf, and others, who in turn had built on earlier scholarship. 102. He accepted Hupfeld's 4 sources and, in agreement with Graf, placed the priestly work last. 94. J was the earliest document, a product of the 10th century BCE and the court of Solomon. E was from the 9th century in the northern kingdom of Israel, and had been combined by a redactor, editor, with J to form a document. J. Winking and laughing smiley. The third source was a product of the 7th century BCE. By 620 BCE, during the reign of King Josiah, P. what Wellhausen first named Q, was a product of the priest and temple dominated world of the 6th century, and the final redaction, when P was combined with J to produce the Torah as we now know it. 103, 104. Wellhausen's explanation of the formation of the Torah was also an explanation of the religious history of Israel. 104. The Yahwist and Elohist described a primitive, spontaneous and personal world, in keeping with the earliest stage of Israel's history. In Deuteronomy saw the influence of the prophets and the development of an ethical outlook, which he felt represented the pinnacle of Jewish religion. and the priestly source reflected the rigid, ritualistic world of the priest-dominated post-exilic period. 105. His work, notable for its detailed and wide-ranging scholarship and close argument, entrenched the new documentary hypothesis as the dominant explanation of Pentateuch origins from the 19th to the late 20th centuries. 94. Note 1. Collapse of the documentary consensus. The consensus around the documentary hypothesis collapsed in the last decades of the 20th century. 106. Three major publications of the 1970s caused scholars to seriously question the assumptions of the documentary hypothesis: Abraham in History and Tradition by John Van Setters, Der sogenannte Jahrweist, the so-called Jahrweist, by Hans Heinrich Schmid, and Das Überlieferungsgeschichtliche Problem des Pentateuch, the tradition historical problem of the Pentateuch, by Rolf Rentef. These three authors shared many of the same criticisms of the documentary hypothesis, but were not in agreement about what paradigm ought to replace it. 107. Van Setters and Schmid both forcefully argued, to the satisfaction of most scholars, that the Jahrweist source could not be dated to the Solomonic period, c. 950 BCE, as posited by the paradigm ought to replace it. Hypothesis method of composition agency, redactor / collector / author, mode of entrenched the new documentary hypothesis as the dominant explanation of Pentateuch origins from the 19th to the late 20th centuries. 94. Note 1. Collapse of the documentary consensus. The consensus around the documentary hypothesis collapsed in the last decades of the 20th century. 106. Three major publications of the 1970s caused scholars to seriously question the assumptions of the documentary hypothesis: Abraham in History and Tradition by John Van Setters, Der sogenannte Jahrweist, the so-called Jahrweist, by Hans Heinrich Schmid, and Das Überlieferungsgeschichtliche Problem des Pentateuch, the tradition historical problem of the Pentateuch, by Rolf Rentef. These three authors shared many of the same criticisms of the documentary hypothesis, but were not in agreement about what paradigm ought to replace it. 107. Van Setters and Schmid both forcefully argued, to the satisfaction of most scholars, that the Jahrweist source could not be dated to the Solomonic period, c. 950 BCE, as posited by the documentary hypothesis. They instead dated J to the period of the Babylonian captivity, 597–539 BCE, or the late monarchic period at the earliest. 108. Van Setters also sharply criticized the idea of a substantial Elohist source, arguing that he tends at most to two short passages in Genesis. 109. This view has now been accepted by the vast majority of scholars. 110. Some scholars, following Rentef, have come to espouse a fragmentary hypothesis, in which the Pentateuch is seen as a compilation of short, independent narratives, which were gradually brought together into larger units in two editorial phases, the Deuteronomic and the priestly phases. 4, 5, 6. By contrast, scholars such as John Van Setters advocate a supplementary hypothesis, which posits that the Torah is the result of two major additions, Jahrweist and priestly, to an existing corpus of work. 7. Scholars frequently use these newer hypotheses in combination with each other and with a documentary model, making it difficult to classify contemporary theories as strictly one or another. 11. The majority of scholars today continue to recognize Deuteronomy as a source, with its origin in the law code produced at the court of Josiah as described by De Wet, subsequently given a frame during the exile. the speeches and descriptions at the front and back of the code, to identify it as the words of Moses. 111. Most scholars also agree that some form of priestly source existed, although its extent, especially its endpoint, is uncertain. 112. The remainder is called collectively non-priestly, a grouping which includes both pre-priestly and post-priestly material. 113. The general trend in recent scholarship is to recognize the final form of the Torah as a literary and ideological unity, based on earlier sources, likely completed during the Persian period, 539-333 BCE. 1214. Some scholars would place its final compilation somewhat later, however, in the Hellenistic period, 333-164 BCE. 16. Contemporary models. The table is based on Latin Walter Houston's The Pentateuch, with expansions as indicated. 114. Note that the three hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. Hypothesis method of composition agency, redactor / collector / author, mode of analysis strengths and weaknesses documentary a small number of continuous documents, traditionally for combine to form one a continuous final text. Combined by editors altered as little as possible of the texts available to them. Source criticism explains both the unity of the Torah, due to the unity of the constituent documents, and its diversity, due to disagreements / repetitions between them. Difficulty distinguishing J from E outside Genesis. 115. Greatest weakness is the role of the redactors, editors, who seem to function as a deus ex machina to explain away difficulties. 116. Supplementary produced by the successive addition of layers of supplementary material to a core text or group of texts. Editors are also authors creating original narrative and interpretation. Redaction criticism accounts for the structural consistency of the Pentateuch better than the fragmentary approach, the central core claiming its unity of theme and structure. The fragments embedded in this its diversity of language and style. 96. Fragmentary, the combination of the large number of short texts. Editors also create linking narrative. For criticism has difficulty accounting for the structural consistency of the Pentateuch, especially its chronology. 96. Neo-documentary hypothesis. A revised neo-documentary hypothesis still has adherents, especially in North America and Israel. 117. This distinguishes sources by means of plot and continuity rather than stylistic and linguistic concerns, and does not tie them to stages in the evolution of Israel's religious history. 117. Its resurrection of an E-source is probably the element most often criticized by other scholars, as it is rarely distinguishable from the classical J-source, and European scholars have largely rejected it as fragmentary or non-existent. 118. Supplementary hypothesis. The modern supplementary hypothesis came to a head in the 1970s with the publication of works by John Van Setters and Hans Heinrich Schmid. Van Setters' summation of the hypothesis accepts three sources or literary strata within the Pentateuch which have come to be known as the Deuteronomist, D, the Yahwist, J, and the priestly writer, P. Van Setters ordered the sources chronologically as DJP. 47. The Deuteronomist source, D, was likely written c. 620 BCE. The Yahwist source, J, was likely written c. 540 BCE in the exilic period. The priestly source, P, was likely written c. 400 BCE in the post-exilic period. The supplementary hypothesis denies the existence of an extensive Elohist, E, source, one of the four independent sources described in the documentary hypothesis. Instead, it describes the Yahwist as having borrowed from an array of written and oral traditions, combining them into the J source. It proposes that because J is compiled from many earlier traditions and stories, documentarians mistook the compilation as independent document. C 620 BCE. Response to D. C. 540 BCE. Largely a redactor of J. C. 400 BCE. Having multiple authors. The Yahwist, J, and the Elohist, E.